Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, you all are having a wonderful day today. So, I thought that we would review this little video because I thought that it would be very, very interesting. And this video overall is going to be by Boxing Ego, who, of course, is a part of new media. And we all know usually would try to narrate what type of narratives, that they try to promote. But I think that this video overall will be very, very interesting because it'll give me a chance to talk about Canelo Alvarez's next fight against Olunga Makabu, which of course I've already talked about a couple times. But it'll also give me a chance to talk about the possibility, maybe later on down the line, of there being a possible Canelo Alvarez versus Oleksandr Usyk match at the Cruiserweight division. Now, do I believe that that fight maybe would ever happen? Possibly, but we'll talk about that a little bit in this video. Anyways, of course, from what we know, Canelo Alvarez, his more than likely next move, that's if Mr. Olunga Makabu, who of course is the recent WBC champion at the Cruiserweight division. Olunga Makabu, of course, has a mandatory, I believe, in his next fight, I believe next month in January. So, of course, if he can get past that opponent, then more than likely Canelo Alvarez versus Olunga Makabu is going to happen. And I do think all in all that actually is a very decently great fight. Now, am I saying that because I think that Olunga Makabu isn't a great fighter? No, I'm not saying that. But in my opinion, he would be a decent B grade fighter. That's why I compared this fight. That's if Canelo Alvarez does allow him to rehydrate to his full max weight. And if there is no catch weight, or at least no major catch weight, we'll see what happens. If Canelo Alvarez does allow him to rehydrate at full strength, then in my opinion, this fight would be very similar to the John Ruiz versus Roy Jones Jr. fight. And of course, a certain amount of people, they basically say, oh, you can't even compare it to that. No, actually, it would be very similar. Dante's Boxing Nation and a certain amount of other people, they say, oh, well, Canelo's fighting a guy that's already been knocked out multiple times, and he doesn't have that much of an A-grade skill set. And, well, no, of course, he's not an A-grade fighter. But neither was John Ruiz. I don't know why so many people now are trying to change the narrative that John Ruiz, was such this, great fighter, because he was not. John Ruiz was the clear weakest link as a champion at the heavyweight division. Like I said, Roy Jones Jr., he didn't have to fight John Ruiz. He could have went up and fought Lennox Lewis, but he never challenged Lennox Lewis, at least from what I remember. Why? Because I think Roy Jones Jr. knew that Lennox Lewis would be a little bit too much out of his range, because Roy Jones Jr. was never a natural cruiserweight. Roy Jones Jr. at his heaviest maybe was a natural light heavyweight, because Roy Jones Jr. would rehydrate at about 190 at his max. So it is what it is, maybe a little bit over that. So like I said, Roy Jones, when he was facing John Ruiz, he was facing someone that was about 30 pounds bigger. So it's not that, John Ruiz was an A-grade fighter. That's not the reason overall why we take a look at that fight and say, wow, it was such a fantastic performance. We look at that performance and say it was such a fantastic performance because overall, Roy Jones Jr. really should have never been in that weight class in the first place. Whether John Ruiz was an A-grade opponent or not, it just is what it is. It's the same thing here with Canelo Alvarez and Makabu. If he does allow Makabu to rehydrate to full weight, then of course, if Canelo is somehow able to defeat him, it's going to be very decently impressive. Because that means that if he's outweighed by a person by even 20 or 30 pounds, Canelo was still able to defeat that opponent. So it's going to be very, very interesting, like I said. It'll be very interesting to see if Canelo allows him to rehydrate at max weight. It'll be very interesting, and like I said, I am decently excited for that fight. That's why I think that it's a decent matchup. However, from what I hear, Mr. Oleksandr Usyk, and if I'm being honest about Oleksandr Usyk, just taking a look at his resume and how he was able to, in my opinion, dominate a very talented at the time cruiserweight division. I don't know if I would necessarily claim that any of the fighters at the cruiserweight division were A plus necessarily, but in my opinion, you could debate some of them as at least a good A grade fighter, such as the Bradis, the Latvian, I believe, or perhaps he's from somewhere else. I can't remember. Of course, you had Michael Hunter there, and Oleksandr Usyk was able to get him. He was able to defeat Murat Gassiev. He was able to defeat Tony Bellew. He was able to defeat Marco Huck. Oleksandr Usyk clearly showed his class, and he was able to completely unify and win the Muhammad Ali trophy, I believe, in that division, and completely unify all the belts. So not only did Oleksandr Usyk show his class there, but then he went up to heavyweight. He beat Derek Chisora, who was not one of the top 10 contenders at the time, but probably one of the top 15. Of course, he beat Chaz Witherspoon. But of course, the cherry on top, of course, was that Anthony Joshua win. And it wasn't really even that close of a fight. I thought Oleksandr Usyk clearly beat him at least 8 rounds to 4, if not 9 rounds to 3. And that was an excellent win. That was an A-grade win because Anthony Joshua, in my opinion, he's at least an A-grade fighter, if not an A-plus fighter for sure. because he was a person that was almost completely unified within that whole entire weight division. He had defeated top contender after top contender, including Dillian White, Joseph Parker, Andrew Ruiz, Alexander Povetkin, Vladimir Klitschko, even though he was a bit older. So Anthony Joshua was no joke of a fighter, and Oleksandr Usyk was completely able to embarrass him. Oleksandr Usyk, in my opinion, if we're really debating it, he probably actually, all in all, would probably be my second overall pound for pound fighter. Now, some people, of course, would disagree. Some would argue someone else, maybe like a Terrence Bud Crawford or an Errol Spence Jr. But when I take a look at Errol Spence Jr., not only does he have work within just one weight division, but he's never been completely unified. And I don't know if I can really argue that in any of his wins that he has an A-plus win. In my opinion, that win over Anthony Joshua, that's an A-plus win for Oleksandr Usyk. Now, if Errol Spence were able to defeat a Terrence Bud Crawford, then in my opinion, that would be an A-plus win, and that could put him debatably in the number one pound-for-pound conversation. Same with Terrence Bud Crawford if he were able to defeat Errol Spence Jr. So we'll see what goes on with that. That'll be very, very interesting. But the big question is, would Canelo Alvarez versus Oleksandr Usyk ever happen? Because that's a very interesting fight, because both Canelo Alvarez and Oleksandr Usyk, in my opinion, they're both A-plus fighters. They're both at least top 3 pound-for-pound fighters. As of right now, I have Canelo Alvarez as my number 1 pound-for-pound. And as I just recently said, I probably would have Oleksandr Usyk as my number 2 overall pound-for-pound. And then right behind him, either an Errol Spence Jr., Terrence Crawford, or Tyson Fury, one of those 3. But when it comes down to it, Oleksandr Usyk, in my opinion, is extremely talented. He really is a generational type of talent. If Canelo somehow were able to go up to 200 pounds, even if somehow there was a little bit of a catch weight, but not a major catch weight, if Canelo Alvarez were able to defeat an Oleksandr Usyk, especially one that may still remain undefeated, I think all in all that Canelo Alvarez, if he were able to defeat him, he may have to be in my top 10 boxers of all time, to be quite honest with you, if you were able to pull that off. But I'm not sure if Canelo Alvarez would even dare to take that fight, and that's not me saying that Canelo does not like challenges. I'm not one of these guys that says that Canelo ducks everybody and all sort of stuff. I've never been a fan of that narrative. I've never, overall tried to promote that. But when it comes down to it, I do think that Canelo may realize that Oleksandr Usyk, that might be a little bit too big for him. He may realize that Oleksandr Usyk not only is highly skilled, but he may just be a little bit too much for him in terms of the weight and his skill set. Kind of like how Roy Jones Jr. realized against Lennox Lewis that, he may just be a little bit too big and a little bit too skilled to possibly take on that challenge. So it is what it is. But anyways, Eagles are going to talk about it. Let's get into it.
Bad news. Canelo gets called a handsome man and gets called out by Oleksandr Usyk. Stay tuned to this video. We're going to talk about all that. What up, Fight World? It's your boy Ego, and I'm back with some more boxing. Please, happy holidays. Throw a like on the video. You don't understand how encouraging that is when you guys do that and how much that helps. Also, if you're looking for holiday gifts, consider using some of my links. Amazon, I got a storefront, an influencer storefront. If you have any purchases, you want to see some of the gadgets and tech that I use. Also, the Hibernation 5s, headphones, great gift for yourself or others. Now, Usyk says that Canelo Alvarez is a handsome man. So handsome to the point where he would go back down to fight him. And I'm not even going to say pause.
Usyk. I'm not even going to say pause. Yo, for some of you overall that don't remember Boxing Eagle during the Deontay Wilder Tyson Fury trilogy match, you should have heard the way that this dude was obsessing over Deontay Wilder's body. I mean, he literally sounded like he was like Deontay Wilder's fiance or some shit. Anyway.
It says, if Canelo wants to box with me at Cruiserweight, then I could go down there. But only on the condition that I'll still have my heavyweight belts because I'll go back up there later. So Usyk is making it loud and clear that he would entertain and go back down to Cruiserweight, most likely only for a guy like Canelo, who has stated that he wants to move up to Cruiserweight. Because if you look at it, there's no other Cruiserweight fight that makes more sense. But he's saying, like, I'm a beast. I could flex and flex my weight and go back down to the Cruiserweight division to entertain or make a fight with Canelo Alvarez. I'm that confident, right? In another interview, this is also what he said. I'll highlight it in green, lucky green. He says, Oleksandr Usyk, when asked about a potential cruiserweight fight with Canelo Alvarez, quote, Canelo is a handsome man. Told you, he said it. Canelo is a handsome man, he says. If he wants to box with me at cruiserweight, then I go down there on one condition, that I still have my heavyweight belts, because I'll go back there later. So, it's basically the same quote with the full quote. I don't know why he called him a handsome man. To be honest, I don't know what that has to do with the.
Basically, what Oleksandr Usyk overall is saying, because Oleksandr Usyk is a person that not only you see a little bit of a comedian when it comes down, but he likes to fuck with you a little bit mentally. Basically, what Oleksandr Usyk is saying is that yes, Canelo Alvarez is such a handsome man that it would be a pleasure to bash him in the face. That's overall what Oleksandr Usyk is saying. At least that's what I get from it. But we'll see what happens there. Like I said, that would be a very, very interesting fight.
Boxing stuff. But I specifically had made a statement. Now, this is what I love about my job. It's all online based. So I'm able to give you guys my truest thoughts and speak my mind. And ultimately, if anybody, because there's some people that just get the message straight away. A lot of people, actually. They hear the content, they listen, they comprehend. They're like, okay, I see where ego is going with the content. But there are some people who, they fight it tooth and nail, and they act as if what I'm speaking is not perfect, clear, eloquent English, and they can't make sense of what's being said. So again, the beauty about what I do online is all of my work is recorded. I have no choice. So you could always refer back to these videos. And I was on record, am on record, I guess you could say, with saying that Canelo versus the Makbuk Air guy, the African guy at Cruiserweight, what's the basis? What's the point? Unheralded, unknown name.
Well, the point overall is very clear: to accomplish history. That's what the point is. And that's what Canelo Alvarez realizes. It is what it is. It was kind of like when George St. Pierre, when he came back to UFC and, he won that middleweight title over Michael Bisping. Now, Michael Bisping, in my opinion, wasn't a great fighter, but he was not, possibly even as talented as some of the other middleweights that were there that were not the champion at the time, like a Robert Whittaker or a Yoel Romero. Who knows, maybe if George would have fought them, it would have been a different story. But George realizes, that was a very smart move. It's kind of like the Kevin Durant to Golden State Warriors situation. People will discredit him at the time, but later on when people take a look at it, people will say, wow, Kevin Durant is the two-time NBA champion. If he's not able to win more, wow, George St. Pierre is a two-weight division champion. There's only a certain amount of fighters in history that have been able to accomplish that. Not even John Jones or Anderson Silva, were able to do that. Wow, Canelo Alvarez, he's a five-weight division champion. He was able to go up all the way to cruiserweight and win a belt. So Canelo knows what this means.
Who's really looking forward to that fight? This is just kind of an excuse for Canelo to move up in weight and try to beat a guy who only became a champion when fighters like Usyk left the division, probably through politics, because cruiserweight, as I've often stated, is a division where it's never really been the poppin' division like welterweight, lightweight. You got other divisions like middleweight, heavyweight.
Yes, but just because cruiserweight, all in all, usually on average throughout the history of boxing has not been a talented division, does not mean that at certain moments it cannot be talented. And like I said, cruiserweight, Canelo knows that if he makes this move to cruiserweight, and if he is able to beat Makabub or one of the other cruiserweights there, and if he's able to become a five-weight division champion, especially if he does not have it at a catchweight or a severe catchweight, it's going to be looked at as very great on Canelo Alvarez's part.
Those are popping divisions where historically heavyweight. I mean, just think about how many of the great heavyweights from Muhammad Ali to Mike Tyson. I'm flabbergasted. Every time I'm not a textbook fighter. I fight to win, totally to win, right? To Lennox Lewis, to Ray Mercer, Tommy Morrison, Ernie.
I think Mike Tyson was a great fighter, but a lot of people sure talk about Mike Tyson being in the all-time great conversation when let's be real about Mike here for a second. And I like Mike. Mike was, and I know a lot of people say that when they're about to try to tear someone down. I'm not trying to, but I actually Mike Tyson is what got me into boxing. I used to be a mega Mike Tyson fan, when I was younger. But of course, you grow up and be more logical and objective. But when we really take a look at Mike Tyson objectively, I mean, he was a great fighter. Don't get me wrong. He probably is a top 10 heavyweight of all time, but he would have to be on the lower end of the tier because Mike Tyson, against every A-class fighter he ever fought, not only did he lose, he pretty much got his ass kicked.
Shavers, Sonny Liston, Joe Frazier.
So let me say this, and a certain amount of people may disagree. Mike Tyson, for example, cannot be compared on the Canelo Alvarez level.
Smoking Joe. And the list goes on and on. But then you can look at classic like middleweights, Hagglers and whatnot. You can look at classic welterweights, Sugar Ray Leonard, Floyd Mayweather, Pacquiao fought at welterweight, etc. Current Terrence Crawford, Errol Spence, and the list goes on. And Jerron Boots Ennis looks like he's one of those ones that's going to be here for a while, right? But then when you think of cruiserweight, how many cruiserweights can you think of that are just the bomb biggity, right? Evander Holyfield.
Yes, but there has been great cruiserweights in the past. And once again, it's not like Canelo Alvarez has not won belts in other weight divisions, so at the end of the day, it is what it is. Tommy Hearns overall ended up winning a belt, I believe, in the cruiserweight division, and a lot of people talk about that to this day. So it is what it is.
Holyfield, Usyk, right?
Like I said, it's very interesting because these same people, they'll always give Roy Jones Jr. credit or Tommy Hearns credit, for beating certain people at higher weight classes, even at the time if they weren't that talented of fighters. But as soon as Canelo was making the move to cruiserweight, all of a sudden they're like, oh, well, cruiserweight really ain't that good and all this sort of stuff, But anyway.
You can name a couple guys that fought at cruiserweight. And I'm not really referring to like guys like Roy Jones who fought at cruiserweight, but he wasn't really a cruiserweight. You know what I'm saying? Like, I'm not talking about like back halves of their career. I'm talking about like they made their bones fighting at cruiserweight. I'm telling you, the list is very slim. And without Google, without Wikipedia, I want you guys, if you disagree, let me know in the comment section. Leave me a comment with all the cruiserweights, historically great people that made their name at cruiserweight that you could think of. So,
well, right, it's understandable that cruiserweight is not necessarily known as an all-time great weight division, but when it comes down to, or at least a division that has had a certain amount of all-time great fighters, there's only a few like Evander Holyfield and Oleksandr Usyk and a few others. But the point being is this, at the end of the day, like I said, just because someone wins over a fighter within usually a very talented weight division, that doesn't mean that they beat a very talented fighter. Now, if Roy Jones Jr., if he would have beat Lennox Lewis, overall at the heavyweight division, who knows? Roy Jones Jr. may still have a debate as the greatest fighter of all time. But he beat John Ruiz. It is what it is. Canelo realizes that he probably may not be able to handle the Oleksandr Usyk or someone within that sort, but he realizes that beating a Makabu would be a decent overall change for history, at least for him. So like I said, I don't have a problem with that move.
Just start typing away. Don't research it, because I know some of you guys are cheaters, and in an effort to try to prove me wrong, you'll not be able to suggest the answer to the question. So you'll look it up, and then you'll start typing in a bunch of cruiserweights as if you knew it. That's not the name of the game. So if you're doing that, you're only lying to yourself. So that's what it is. Usyk is a guy who is now historically great because he's undisputed at cruiserweight. So he's calling Canelo Alvarez a handsome man, and he's calling Canelo out and saying that.
I mean, let's just talk about Terrence Bud Crawford here for a second. Now, 140 on average was usually more talented than that overall of, say, maybe 200 pounds. Although I wouldn't say that, 140 at the time when Terrence Crawford unified, I certainly wouldn't say that it was more talented than 200 pounds when Oleksandr Usyk unified it. That's just my personal opinion. Because you had not only, just some undefeated fighters there, but some undefeated fighters that, were very decently talented. Like a Bradis, or, like a Michael Hunter, or like a Murat Gassiev. I'm sorry, but I don't think Victor Postal, I don't know if he's on any of those guys' level. It just is what it is. But we can talk about Terrence Crawford and say, yeah, well, is 140 really where it's at? Is it really where it's at compared to middleweight or 147? Or let's take a look at it historically. We can take a look at it like that and say, well, there's really no reason for us to give extra credit to Terrence Crawford because he unified 140. But at the end of the day, he was able to do it. So you still have to give him credit for that. And if Terrence is able to defeat a certain amount of these other A-class fighters like a Keith Thurman or Danny Garcia, Earl Spence, Jermell Charlo, he's going to get even extra credit for unifying 140 pounds. So it is what it is.
And when I was doing my videos about Canelo, payday, you want payday.
Now, don't get me wrong. You have to take things into context. Just like I do with Terrence Bud Crawford, I don't think that him unifying 140 at the time was, don't get me wrong, it was a great accomplishment. Let me not, shit all over Terrence Crawford because I'm not trying to do that. But Terrence Bud Crawford, let's be real, there was really no definitive A-class fighters that he defeated at 140 at the time. At least with Canelo, we know that he has defeated a multitude of A-class fighters.
I know that. Going to Cruiserweight, I said, why is he going up to fight MacBook Air? How come he didn't consider moving up when Usyk was there? If he really thought, I got cruiserweight skills and I can, beat someone.
Because he probably knows that Oleksandr Usyk is a little bit too much. Once again, no one ever asked with Roy Jones Jr., how come Roy Jones Jr. didn't challenge Lennox Lewis? You know why? Because Roy Jones Jr. knew that Lennox Lewis was a little bit more than he could chew. So Canelo Alvarez is, he's intelligent enough to know that. Like I said, if he does take the Oleksandr Usyk match, I expect more than likely that it either happen at a weight drain or it would happen towards the end of his career or maybe a little bit later on where he has nothing else to prove in his career. So we'll see what happens.
Because, like what I said, Canelo is a vulture, an opportunist, and he's trying to cherry pick a guy who is the weakest link and knock that branch off.
Well, it's not really a cherry. Well, in my opinion, it's not really a cherry pick. Now, if you want to say that this is an opportunist move, I don't have a problem with that. But what Roy Jones Jr. did against John Ruiz was that was a vulture move then, in your opinion. Once again, there's a reason why I compare this to Roy Jones Jr. versus John Ruiz. Because this is very, very similar. Roy Jones Jr. purposely picked the weakest link at heavyweight. But the reason why it was special was because Roy Jones Jr. was going to be outweighed by 30 damn pounds. Like I said, it would be like a Mayweather move to the middleweight division, and he fought, say, like an Andy Lee or a Peter Quillen at the time when they were champion. Because really, when you take a look at those fighters, they're about on the same level in terms of peak. And if you don't believe me, go ahead and take a look at their fight because there's a reason why they had a draw against each other. They had a great fight. Those guys, they were known for being decent middleweights, but they were never A grade in my opinion. So that's what that would be similar like.
A guy like Usyk, who's quality for real, at heavyweight and at cruiserweight, and it took a minute because at heavyweight he wasn't looking like the same fighter, but he just beat Joshua, so you got to give him his props at this point. So a guy skilled like that, let's see if Canelo answers the call to fight a cruiserweight who we know is good, and this is...
Yes, but once again, that would be like Floyd Mayweather Jr. going up to middleweight and facing a Gennady Golovkin or a Sergio Martinez. Well, what did these guys always used to say? They always used to bitch, moan, and complain and say, you guys are really complimenting Floyd Mayweather Jr. because, Floyd, he's not even a natural welterweight. So why would you want him to fight a natural middleweight? You just want to see him lose. It's the same thing when it comes to Canelo versus Oleksandr Usyk. You know what I mean? Oleksandr Usyk at his heaviest, he's going to outweigh Canelo Alvarez by 30 pounds plus.
That's why I'm not really a big fan, and I don't really fancy these radical weight jumps because at the end of the day, it's really for show. It's like almost getting a car.
Well, it depends on overall what it is. Like I said, if it's like a Mikey Garcia with the bullshit that he was doing, and he went to go up to 140 and face Sergey Lipinets, And a lot of people fell for that bullshit, and they're like, "Oh, he's chasing history and all this other bullshit." Well, sure, you're a 4-weight division champion, but you were only outweighed. Really, Mikey, to be honest with you, you can argue that he's a natural 140 pounder. So it is what it is. Now, if he would have defeated Errol Spence at 147, that would have been something really, really special. But like I said, if you were facing, say, like once again, like I said, if you were facing someone like an Anthony Yard at 175, then I'd be like, okay, you know what? That's a cherry pick. That's not really that good of a move. But like I said, Makabu, he could possibly outweigh Canelo Alvarez by a decent 20 pounds, if not more. So like I said, this is going to be a very interesting, at least matchup.
And you have a lot of money, but you don't have a driver's license. So you get this nice fancy car, but it stays in your driveway because you don't know how to drive. You know what I mean? And Canelo going up to fight Makbuk Air instead of guys like Jamal Charlo, David Benavidez, Jermel Charlo. I'm not Jermel. Jamal Charlo, David Benavidez, Better Biev, Marcus Brown winner. Somebody like that.
Well, those are all fights that eventually, in my opinion, can happen. But like I said, Canelo Alvarez, he realizes that he realizes that this is a once in a lifetime opportunity. It is what it is. Now, some people will say, well, because it is somewhat of a vulture move, or because he realizes that Makabu is a weaker opponent, should he really get credit for winning a fifth, title, or should he get credit for winning in a fifth weight class? Well, that depends. Do you think Roy Jones Jr. should get credit for winning in the heavyweight division? Do you think overall that Tommy Hearns should get credit for winning in the cruiserweight division? Because I don't hear anybody, usually complain about that.
He's just going up there for show. Now he's being called out by a real threat that we know is good. And he says the only condition is, the heavyweight division make a exception for a big fight and allow me to keep my belts because I don't want to lose my belts by making the weight. So Usyk, he's really a beast. He's a beast. The fact that he just weighed in probably at a career high versus Anthony Joshua.
That's another person that new media or the LDBC really don't talk a whole lot about, and they're going to start using Oleksandr Usyk more than likely to probably try to dethrone Canelo Alvarez. But I remember I did a video the other day, and I think that most of you guys ended up watching it. And if you guys remember, Dante said that, Josh Taylor and, Stephon Fulton and Gervonta Tank Davis and Devin Haney, these are the only fighters, and Terrence Crawford, these are the only fighters that end up believing in themselves, because they want to fight the best of the best. How come he didn't say Oleksandr Usyk or Tyson Fury? Because they've always fought the fighters that have challenged them. You know why he didn't do it? Because he knows that both of those fighters are top pound for pound fighters, and he does not want to have those Caucasian fighters super highly ranked. It is what it is.
But he's still...
Now, why overall will he not do that with them, but he'll do that overall with Josh Taylor, if you may ask me that question? Because once again, he knows that if Josh Taylor more than likely faces an Errol Spence or a Terrence Crawford, that's going to give them a lot of props because he's a top 10 pound for pound fighter, but he knows more than likely that Terrence Crawford and Errol Spence are going to whoop that ass. That's what he knows. But Oleksandr Usyk and Tyson Fury, they're very decent fighters. There's a chance that, possibly, let's say if they don't fight each other, they could retire undefeated at the end of their careers.
He thinks he can make cruiserweight, or he knows he can make cruiserweight to fight a great fighter in Canelo Alvarez. I'm not going to hold my hopes up that this fight happens because I know how Canelo moves, so I don't think it will happen. Because the idea is not, hey, I think I'm a real cruiserweight and I could really beat some quality fighter at cruiserweight.
Well, you say you know how Canelo Alvarez moves. Like I said, basically he's insinuating that Canelo is a coward. But once again, were you basically saying that Roy Jones Jr. needed to go after Lennox Lewis because all in all, he's not a true heavyweight champion unless he fights Lennox Lewis? Like I said, if you want to go on this narrative and say that Canelo, that he's not facing a real cruiserweight, because he's not facing Oleksandr Usyk, hey man, no problem. But don't be giving Roy Jones Jr. and Tommy Hearns then credit for winning in the upper weight divisions either. That's all I'm saying.
It's, hey, let me fight at cruiserweight because there's this unknown random guy that nobody cares about in the world of boxing and don't sell no tickets, and he's so limited. I feel I could beat that limited guy at a cruiserweight.
Well, he's limited compared to Oleksandr Usyk, but Makabu, like I said, it's not like, to me, like he's a C-grade fighter. People try to act like this dude Makabu is like Breedis Prescott or some shit.
And then call myself multiple division champion, and it's so apparent to see. And it wouldn't be as bad for Canelo if he didn't always move like this. You know what I mean? Like when he fought Kovalev.
And here comes the narrative overall once again that he didn't always move like this. Canelo has fought tough competitor after tough competitor after tough competitor. Like I said, there's only so much that you can say. It's like when I hear, oh, the media always talk shit on Steph Curry. They always like to say that Steph Curry, that, he's a big choke artist. It's like, well, obviously he can't be that big of a choke artist because the dude's a 3-time NBA champion. You know what I mean? Like, it's like when Skip Bayless and Max Kellerman, when they tried to, tear his ass down either on ESPN First Take or Skip and Shannon Undisputed. There's only so much at the end of the day that you can say about a 2-time MVP and 3-time NBA champion. Now, of course, that's a different type of conversation. We'll talk about that another time. And I like talking about basketball here and there, so I may talk about that later on, especially with the season that Stephen Curry is having this season, but we'll see what happens with that. Anyways, when it comes down to it, like I said, there's only so much that you can say about Canelo, who has beaten Miguel Cotto and Ersan Lara and Sergey Kovalev and, all in all, Caleb Plant and Billy Joe Saunders and Callum Smith and Austin Trout. And I mean, it's like, come on, man. Danny Jacobs as well. I mean, there's a certain amount of other fighters that I'm probably not even mentioning. Like I said, they're trying to use Jamal Charlo and Andre and Benavidez to tear down his name. And like I said, I get it to a degree because I want those fights to happen as well. But like I said, Canelo on average faces A-grade fighters. And Boxing Ego was another one of those dudes that actually going into the fight, he said, he said don't underestimate Caleb Plant because Caleb Plant is an A-grade fighter. And now all of a sudden, Canelo beats him, and what does he say? He says that Canelo, he just ducks and dodges, all sort of bullshit. But like I said, Canelo, he will have to face Jamal Charlo and David Benavidez and Demetrius Andrade eventually. He is going to have to face those guys, but like I said, I don't mind those fights not happening for now.
We already know Kovalev was no longer the same fighter, and Kovalev was looking really washed.
No, he wasn't looking really washed. What I will say is that he was not the same fighter. When it comes down to it, of course, he was not the same fighter, but he still was an A- fighter. That's what Kovalev was. All right. In my opinion, it was 60-40 in favor of Canelo. So obviously, Sergey Kovalev, he was not the same fighter when he had fought Andre Ward. I think that that's very fair to say. But Kovalev still was a decent fighter. He completely dominated one of the top contenders, that one Colombian dude, I believe, Alvarez or whatever, Oleksandr Alvarez, who knocked him out in the first fight. Then Kovalev came back, completely outboxed him when it came down to it. And then a little bit later on, he ended up defeating the undefeated Anthony Yard, who, of course, in my opinion, is not an A-grade fighter, but he's a decent B-grade fighter at least, at least for the weight division. Some of the debate C, I would see where you're coming from, but, I would say B, because he's a decent athlete and, he at least overall is a decent fighter. Sure, Kovalev had some problems against him in that fight, but, all in all, he was able to pull out and get the victory. He was able actually to get the knockout. That's when Canelo fought him. It's not like he fought him when he was complete mincemeat, like when Terrence Crawford fought Kilbrook or Amir Khan. But you won't hear Boxing Ego complain about that.
And had almost stopped his previous fight and was on a quick turnaround, etc. We know these things. We know Canelo's a great fighter and has skills. That's never been called into question. It's about, do your opponents have equivalent skills? Like MacBook Air. Is anyone think he, skill for skill, has the wits to match Canelo?
No one thinks that Makabu overall is as intelligent or as talented as a boxer as Canelo, but like I said, do I think that Devin Haney overall is as talented as an all-around boxer as Vasily Lomachenko? No, I don't, but if that fight happened, it would still be a great fight. You know why that is? Because it would be a great challenge for both of them. That's why when you have certain people that are highly skilled, they have to move up the weight classes. Because on average, of course, those fighters, they're not as intelligent overall or as skilled as that all-around opponent. But guess what? That's how the great fighters challenge themselves, by beating guys in bigger weight classes. Like I said, this in my opinion would be like if Mayweather went up to middleweight and beat someone like a Peter Quillen or beat someone like a Andy Lee. That, in my opinion, is what it would be like.
No, of course not. So then it becomes a game of, once you deal with the size and power, if you fight MacBook Air.
And like I said, I don't know I don't know why so many of these guys, they bring up these narratives even about Jamal Charlo or Andre or David Benavidez for. Does anyone think that David Benavidez, Charlo, or Andre have the skill set of a Canelo? No. So it's like, like I said, Caleb Plant and Billy Joe Saunders, they're pretty much on a similar level, in my opinion. It just is what it is. Now, of course, Charlo and Benavidez, especially, those guys are going to happen eventually, and Andrade I would like to see as well. Those fights are going to happen eventually, or Canelo is going to get criticism, especially from me. But when it comes down to it, all in all, bottom line is this. Like I said, as of right now, I don't have a problem with the Makabu fight.
Here, then this is your show. All you have to do is stay safe, of just like, mindful on defense, which you'll be faster than this guy, and, be mindful of his power. But skill for skill, we know that he's nowhere even on the same planet as Canelo. Versus a guy like Usyk, I mean, he has skill, he has footwork, he could really trouble you. And he's calling you out and saying, hey, I'll fight you. I'll be a huckleberry. So we'll see what Canelo decides. Subscribe to the channel.
I like the quote over from the old movie Tombstone.
Happy holidays. And I'm out. The future is now.
Anyways, that's really about it for this video. But I just thought that I would talk about the possibility of there being an Oleksandr Usyk versus Canelo Alvarez match. That would be a great match. But I don't think overall that it would happen right now. It would be very interesting to see. But we'll see all in all if that happens. That would be a very, very interesting fight. Like I said, if somehow Canelo were able to win that fight, he would probably have to go into my top 10 boxers of all time. Unquestionably. Because that would be such a colossal win that really Canelo should have not won in the first place. So it is what it is. But anyways, that's really about it for today. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll talk to you all later.